Welcome to Lesson 13, Vendors and Checks. To begin this lesson, go to the QuickBooks Online demo account as discussed in Lesson 4. Vendors are companies or people to whom you pay money, such as a store, utility, restaurant, or a subcontractor who does work for you. In an earlier lesson, we discussed how to clean up and import your vendors from your old accounting system. This will save you from entering them one by one when you convert to QuickBooks Online. You also saw how to add a vendor on the fly as you categorize transactions in your bank feed. But in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use the Vendors area of QuickBooks Online to add or edit a vendor, and how to write and print checks. From the navigation bar, select Expenses and then Vendors. Here, you see your complete list of vendors. If you need to call Hicks Hardware, scroll down to see their phone number. If you want to see their complete vendor profile, click on the company name, Hicks Hardware. At the top of the vendor profile screen, you will see some details, such as the address. Below that are two tabs, Transaction List and Vendor Details. Click on Vendor Details to see all of the information related to this vendor. The last time you did business with this vendor, a clerk named Dan was rude and unhelpful. Click on the Edit button. Notice there are two, one at the very top of the screen and one in the Details area. In the Notes area, make a note that Dan was rude and unhelpful on June 10, 2020, just so that you have the information for future reference. Notice you also have the option to add an attachment to a vendor. Here you might attach pricing agreements or contracts that govern your relationship, whereas individual receipts would get attached to actual financial transactions rather than the vendor profile. Click Save to commit your changes. Now let's examine the Transaction List tab. This area shows any activity you have had with this vendor in the past. Notice the check in the amount of $228.75. If you want to see the details of any past transaction, click anywhere on the transaction except for the checkbox to the left. When you're finished reviewing the transaction, click the lower X in the upper right to return to the transaction list. Notice the small hamburger control with an arrow to the left of Hicks Hardware's name. This button will display a list of all vendors so that you can move to another record, or you can click on the word vendors to return to the entire list. And of course, you can always go back to your navigation bar and select Expenses Vendors to return to the full list. To add a new vendor, click the green New Vendor button in the upper right. A dialog box appears. Let's add a company named Building Supplies, Inc. Their address is 100 North Main Street, South Bend, Indiana, 43433, with a phone number of 555-555-1212. After completing the details for this vendor, click Save. Now you will see Building Supplies, Inc. in the list. Click on their name to go into their vendor profile. And notice the transaction list is empty because you haven't done business with them yet. A vendor may go out of business or fall out of favor with your organization, but be aware that you cannot delete a vendor. However, you can make a vendor inactive. Let's return to our list of vendors and scroll down to Mahoney Mugs. To make them inactive, click the arrow on the Action drop-down menu beside the vendor. Select Make Inactive. Notice that Mahoney Mugs is no longer in our list. If you ever need to see inactive vendors, scroll to the top of the vendor list and click the small gear. Select Include Inactive. Now you can see Mahoney Mugs and make them active again if desired. Notice that in the same drop-down list you use to make a vendor inactive, there is an option called Write Check. Let's pretend that you are buying $200 worth of batteries from Hicks Hardware. Next to the vendor name, click Write Check. Make sure you're writing the check from the correct bank account. in this case checking, and then select the category for the expenditure. In this case, select supplies, enter a description of batteries, and then enter the amount of $200. If you want to print the check immediately, notice in the bottom middle of the screen is a print check option. But sometimes you may want to write multiple checks and then print them in a batch. In that case, check the box below your check number that says Print Later. Let's check the Print Later box and then click the green Save and Close button in the lower right. So you know how to write a check from your list of vendors, but at any time you can write a check by going to the New button with the plus sign at the top of your navigation bar. From there, select Check. This brings up the same form you just completed for writing a check. However, you need to select your vendor. Let's write a check to Lee Advertising out of the checking account for $800. Put it in the expense category called Advertising with a description of Billboard Ad Design. Check the box that says Print Later and then click Save and Close. Now we have at least 2 checks waiting to be printed. If you return to the New button at the top of the navigation bar, you will see an option called Print Checks. The very first time you go to this area, QuickBooks Online might ask you to set up the type of checks and printer you're using. But once your setup is completed, you can select the checks in your queue that you want to print, set a starting check number, and then click Print. Now, what if you discovered that you had already paid for the advertising work with Lee Advertising? So you need to void the check you wrote. Where do you find the check? Let's look at several options. First, you could go to your list of vendors, locate Lee Advertising, and look at the transaction list. There you see the check, and you can click on the transaction to open it. But let's think about 2 other places you could find this check. You wrote the check from the checking account. So you could go to the chart of accounts, view the register for the checking account, and locate the check transaction. Clicking on the transaction reveals the Edit button that would allow you to make changes. Finally, don't forget that your most recent transactions are shown in the search box at the upper right of QuickBooks Online. If you click the magnifying glass, you should see the check listed there. Select the transaction. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see an option called More. Clicking More reveals the option to void the check. Now, from an accounting perspective, you must understand that transactions should never be deleted, even if they were created in error. Deleting a transaction looks suspicious in an audit. If you delete check 174, for example, there would be no evidence of what happened to it. So voiding check 174 and perhaps entering a reason for voiding it provides a bunny trail that can be followed if necessary. And since we're on the topic of audits, let's go up to the gear in the upper right corner of QuickBooks Online. A handy feature under the Tools column is the audit log. The audit log details every action taken in QuickBooks Online, including who did it and when they did it. I had a client who was sneaking into his office on Sundays when nobody was around and doing things that he wasn't supposed to be doing in the accounting system. Fortunately, the audit log told us everything we needed to know about who was causing problems. At this point, you should be comfortable with managing your vendors, writing checks, and accessing the audit log.